Welcome to the Silver Screen Guide podcast, where we discuss films from every genre. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the podcast. Hey Alan, do you think you could beat Bruce Lee?
I don't know.
What if he wasn't allowed to kick and you were really mad?
Perhaps.
Today we are discussing Unbreakable. This is your co-host Corbin.
I'm Allen, and once again, probably this is more, I guess, more of a sleeper hit for, a sleeper hit for M. Night Shyamalan. This one is definitely one of his better ones, but also not very many people talk about this one as much as they do, like, The Sixth Sense.
Right. This one seems to have a bit more of a cult following, and cult followings usually develop many years after it's been released. And we'll talk about how this movie was received at the time of its release. But yeah, this is Shyamalan's fourth film. It's his follow-up to The Sixth Sense, which means it would have been on a lot of people's agenda, probably, to see, because The Sixth Sense was so huge. So, listeners, if you haven't heard our review for The Sixth Sense yet, go back and watch that. And we also did review his previous two films as well. And as I promised, I did review Stuart Little. I did a written review. So that is in the link to the Sixth Sense podcast. So go over and head on over there. Also, while you're at it, that review is up on Letterboxd. So go ahead and follow me on Letterboxd. And you can see all of the new movies that I watch throughout the week. And you can hear my thoughts on them as well. But The Sixth Sense came out in 1999, right?
Yep.
Well, Unbreakable was a quick turnaround. Came out November 22nd, 2000.
Right. I remember reading somewhere that M. Night Shyamalan had kind of this idea of Unbreakable. I think it came to him right when he was shooting The Sixth Sense. So
yes.
It wasn't too long after The Sixth Sense wrapped that he began production on Unbreakable here.
Well, Alan, have you seen Unbreakable before this recording?
I have. I think this was actually my very first Shyamalan movie I'd ever really watched. I remember I watched it for the first time in high school, and I believe it was for like English class or something. I forget what the reason was as to why we were watching it, but I remember I did watch this in school, in high school. Who knows when that was, but that was my first introduction to it. I think I watched it one or two more times after that. Trying to remember when that was. I think one of them was when I was in college. So this is not my first time seeing this movie. This is probably my third or fourth time coming back to it and watching it again. And there are still, I'll mention these scenes, but there are still scenes that I remember seeing every single time. I'm just like, oh yeah, this scene. I remember this scene. And they always kind of stick with me. I'll mention those. But yeah, this would be my, third or fourth time probably coming back to this movie. My very first Shyamalan, I had ever watched.
Oh wow, I didn't know this was your first Shyamalan. This was not my first Shyamalan, discounting Stuart Little. Like I mentioned in the previous podcast, sort of The Sixth Sense, and I'm like, dang, M. Night Shyamalan is so scary, I don't know if I can watch any of his other stuff. But we did have some neighbors who were big fans of the movie Signs. They even gave me a poster of the movie. So they have a theater room in their basement, and they said, hey, this was during the summer. They said, why don't you come over and watch it, before you go back to school? Let's watch Signs. And so I was pretty excited to see Signs. So I guess if memory serves, Signs would be like my actual full length experience. I didn't come to Unbreakable. I had seen a few more of his movies that we have yet to review. I've seen those before I saw Unbreakable, and if I'm not mistaken, Praying with Anger and Wide Awake have been my newest experiences, but Unbreakable has been also a more recent one as well, because you and I actually watched Split together February 10th, 2018, and then 6 days later I rented Unbreakable. So the first time I saw Unbreakable was February 16th, 2018, and I'm coming back to it about a little over a year later, so just for this review.
Right. And I suppose my first technically Shyamalan movie would have been Stuart Little, but that isn't exactly one that he directed.
Yeah.
Because I watched that a bunch when I was a kid. But yeah, in terms of Shyamalan, the director, this would be my first. It is kind of funny because, actually pretty recently, I think we were traveling somewhere and my mom was watching a movie, I think maybe off of Netflix or something. And she said that she wanted to watch this other movie called, I think it was like, oh gosh, what was it called? Now I gotta look it up because it has a very similar title to Unbreakable.
Oh.
I think it's like Unbroken. Yeah. So she was trying to watch a movie called Unbroken. Well,
okay.
She accidentally came across Unbreakable.
Oh.
And she was a little bit confused at first because this was not the movie that she had seen before because she had seen Unbroken before.
That's
and
funny.
Then I was like, Mom, I think you're watching Unbreakable. She goes, what is it about? I'm just like, oh, I kind of told her what it was about and she goes, oh, all right. And then she continued to watch it. And I think she ended up liking it, which it was just kind of funny because that's totally not a movie my mom would ever watch. At least not on purpose.
That does surprise me. I didn't expect that. That's funny. Yeah. I knew this was a movie a lot of people had seen. I had always kind of heard about it. And the poster was always famous. I had no idea what it was about until last year, pretty much. So I was very new coming to this, but I've got a running list of movies everyone has seen but me, and this one was on it. So,
yeah, and I know I have a pretty similar list somewhere, or at least it's in my head.
Right.
I know it's very extensive.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, Shyamalan's like, hey, I want to make a superhero movie next while filming The Sixth Sense. So he approached Bruce Willis. He's like, hey, you want to be in my next movie, like right after this one? And Willis was like, sure, sounds cool. So Samuel L. Jackson, the part was written for him, but he didn't really know of anything about it. But apparently Willis and Jackson ran into each other at a casino in Casablanca, which sounds unbelievable. Sounds like it's straight out of the movie. Right. And he told him, he's like, hey, Shyamalan has a script for us. And Jackson was like, sounds cool. So Shyamalan did show the script to Disney because Disney, as we know, kind of missed the boat a bit with The Sixth Sense. They did still profit off of it, but he's like, hey, see how successful I am? You want the script? Huh? You want it? Okay, $5 million for the script and another $5 million for me to direct it. Disney was like, okay, sure, no problem. So Disney did buy the script. Of course, they did not release it under Disney. As usual, they always release their more edgier things under Touchstone, which I don't even know if it's still around anymore.
Yeah, that's a good question. It may have been dissolved because you never really see them around anymore.
Right.
So, yeah, who knows what happened to them?
I don't know. But, Julianne Moore was originally cast as Audrey, who would be Willis's character's wife. That really surprised me. But she did drop out to play Clarice Starling in Ridley Scott's Hannibal, which Alan and I did review. You can go listen to our review. Maybe holds the record for our shortest review. You can find...
I guess you're correct. That is probably our shortest one, yeah.
Yeah, listeners, go find out why. Go find out why our review of Hannibal is our shortest review. Well, in my opinion, oops, Julianne Moore chose wrong. She made the wrong choice. But go listen and you'll find out why. Regardless, I personally feel Robin Wright Penn was a better choice for the character of Audrey.
Yeah.
So, Tak Fujimoto did not come back to do the sequel. Well, it's not the sequel. I mean, Shyamalan's follow-up. We got the cinematographer Eduardo Serra, who purposely framed scenes in this movie to simulate the look of a comic book. A lot of kind of flat scenes with, it appears there's depth, but he does an amazing job of making everything kind of everything in the background feel in the forefront. And he did a pretty good job at that.
Yeah. This is, in my opinion, this may be getting into a little bit of spoilers, but I think, at least not really spoilers, but like showing my hand a bit too early here. I think this movie is in terms of its cinematography, looks better than The Sixth Sense. They both look very good, but I think this one for me is more visually pleasing than The Sixth Sense is in terms of cinematography.
Yes, the visuals of this one are incredibly well done, especially when it combined with lighting and a consistent color palette. It's very solid. I don't know. I just thought I would mention this piece of trivia. It seemed very odd to me, but apparently Sam Jackson's wig was patterned after the hairstyle of Frederick Douglass. For those of you who are kind of like, hey, who's Frederick Douglass? He was a freed slave, or he bought his freedom or something. He's an abolitionist and an outspoken anti-slavery guy. Wrote some books, pretty important in the movement to end slavery. So, I mean, I guess if you look up a picture, their hair looks similar, but just like, what? Okay.
That is interesting. I wonder what Shyamalan was thinking about pulling something like that off of a well-known historical figure, which just seems weird considering the movie that we got. But hey, whatever.
It's a little weird. Also, I guess I forgot to mention, I did find it interesting that Robin Wright Penn, if you have ever heard of the actor Sean Penn, well, that's because they were married for a number of years, which I always forget about because they're not married anymore. And she just goes by Robin Wright. And if I'm not mistaken, Alan, you've seen The Princess Bride, right?
It has been years since I've seen that movie. I actually may not have seen it all the way through, and if I have, I don't remember much. Because every time I've watched it, or I tried to watch it 2 other times recently, and I've fallen asleep both times.
Oh my gosh!
Not because I thought it was boring, but because I was super extra tired when I tried to watch it with whoever I was with. So I remember pieces, but I need to watch it again all the way through.
Yeah, you do, because that movie's amazing. Anyways,
that's what I've been told.
Well, Princess Buttercup is Robin Wright. She's Willis's wife here, Audrey. Same lady, just different hairstyles. Well, I don't even think she was Robin Wright Penn back then. I could be wrong, but to me, she's just always been Robin Wright. So it's a little weird when I see Robin Wright Penn, and now she's not anymore. Thank goodness.
Right.
Sean Penn is a nut.
Right. Yeah, I don't keep track of all the who's married to who in the acting industry. It's too confusing because it changes so quick. It's
changes by the day.
It changes so quick. It's just kind of ridiculous to keep track of. So.
Well, Shyamalan got a pretty good sized budget, $75 million, and of course it paid off. Domestically, it really didn't do all that amazing, actually. Domestically, it grossed $95 million. So it just paid, it got a $20 million profit, which is really nothing to write home about.
Yeah, especially with a budget that big. I mean, at least it did make its money back, so it wasn't a complete flop, but it wasn't anything incredible either.
No, nothing like The Sixth Sense, which was doing, I think domestically, it was well over 200 million. In foreign, like 300. I mean, it had like a worldwide gross of close to 700 million. So, but this movie didn't do near those numbers. Foreign markets, 153 million for a worldwide gross of 248 million, which, like I said, was what The Sixth Sense grossed domestically. So this movie, financially, it did well, because with a budget of 75 million and a worldwide total of 248 million, yes, bravo, good job. But yeah, it's a little surprising. Usually when somebody has a smash hit, I call this the Rambo syndrome. When something has a smash hit, the sequel, like First Blood Part 2, will do much better.
Yeah.
And will do gangbusters at the box office.
Right. Yeah, it is interesting that it wasn't super popular here in the States. I mean, to a certain extent it was. But it's that worldwide market that ate it up, which now a bunch of the movie making industries are all kinds of obsessed about China, because that's where our big deal of money comes from. But yeah, they definitely, with the worldwide market, it pushed it way over double, triple its budget, which is good for the movie. But yeah, here in the States, did reasonably well, but not the numbers you would want to strive for.
And opening weekend, it wasn't number 1. It was number 2, actually, with 30 million. It was beat out by Ron Howard / Jim Carrey's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which was in its second week. And of course, that movie was going to do better, especially because they released Unbreakable kind of towards the Christmas season, or even Thanksgiving, I guess would be closer. So I don't know, kind of an interesting time to release it. But the top 5 was Grinch, Unbreakable, 102 Dalmatians, Rugrats in Paris the movie was number 4 at the box office, and finally Charlie's Angels.
That's an interesting list that we have here. That is weird that they decided to release Unbreakable around Christmas time. Mm-hmm. I wonder if it would have been better suited some other time, but hey, that may not have been possible for all we know.
Yeah,
yeah, it's weird that The Grinch was the movie that beat it out.
That's a little unexpected. I think this movie would probably serve better in early fall, would be where I paid.
Yeah. I can see that.
So of the trilogy, so listeners, if you don't know, this is actually Shyamalan's one and only trilogy for now. Unbreakable, Split, and Glass. Of the trilogy, when you adjust for inflation, this is the highest grossing of the 3. And of Shyamalan's films, it's his 4th highest grossing film. So his best days are yet to come at the box office anyway. And this is a superhero movie. If some of you didn't know that, we'll get into exactly how it is. But as far as superhero movies go, it's quite low. It's ranked 73 box office wise, and for superhero origins, it's 34. So, no, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, it's. We'll talk about what exactly is inside the movie, but it takes a much different take on superheroes that really even superhero movies now don't really strive for this kind of a style, especially with Marvel and DC. It's a very different type of superhero movie, just kind of in general.
On IMDb, it has a pretty solid rating of 7.3.
That's honestly, that just seems a little bit low to me, considering how many people love this movie. It is a cult classic, so I'm sure that has something to do with it. But it just seems a bit low than what I was expecting out of a movie called Unbreakable that has a lot of love behind it.
7.3. Yeah, it's fine. But as far as critics go, critics gave it 70% of critics recommended it, and today audiences give it 77% recommendation. So you can see that's kind of in line with IMDb. For the most part, by Rotten Tomato standards, that is a solid recommendation.
Right. Yeah, it's not necessarily a fresh tomato, but it's close. It's a well done tomato, but definitely isn't rotten. Because I believe the certified fresh is like 75% and above.
I don't remember.
I want to say
it's close, somewhere around those numbers. So it's close to being rotten, but it's also close to being fresh, I guess. It's ripe.
Right.
It is just ripe.
Yeah, it's a ripe tomato.
Well, I was pretty surprised to find this little bit of information out. Back in the day, audiences thought this movie stunk. I mean, audiences thought it stunk. Really? They gave it a really bad rating of a C on CinemaScore.
Oof. Yes. Interesting. I wonder what that was all
about. Well,
about.
As you can see, though, from the ratings above, its view has greatly improved. Now, 7.3, 70%, those aren't numbers to write home about. But nevertheless, if you're going to make some kind of correspondence between CinemaScore and IMDb, if you're going to give something a C, that should probably be more so in the low 6s, I would say. I mean, what do you think, Alan?
Yep. I could see it. I mean, we've kind of mentioned this before with CinemaScore. Their ratings are weirdly stacked. So a good movie technically for the audience is pretty much anywhere from, I think we defined it as like B plus or B, right? A normal B and up. Anything below that is just kind of considered not great in terms of the CinemaScore audience. So yeah, I could see a low 6 being defined as a C here.
In the A range, audiences really thought it was great. In the B range, high B's audiences thought it was good. Anything below kind of a high B audiences thought it was fine. And then anything below that audiences really thought just wasn't good. So I'm surprised. I didn't expect audiences at the time to have just been so against this movie.
Yeah. I wonder if, because around this time, there had been no Spider-Man. I don't think the X-Men had come out yet. I want to say the very first X-Men, I think it came out in 2001.
X-Men might have came out in 2000.
Okay, yeah, the first one came out in 2000. It released the 14th of July. So I wonder if that has something to do with it. Where the X-Men has a bit more fantasy added into it than Unbreakable does, because Unbreakable is very much set in realism. So I wonder if maybe it was X-Men that kind of caused this, I guess, dislike with the audience.
Yeah, it's also very different from The Sixth Sense. So audiences may have been thinking, hey, we're going to get another kind of supernatural film. I mean, in a way, there's like a bit of supernatural elements. But also from what I heard, the marketing campaign at the time was trying to ride the coattails of Sixth Sense and showcase Unbreakable as more so a thriller, whereas it's really not.
So I'm sure it's actually a culmination of many different things. X-Men and the marketing team not really representing the film very well, and having a really odd tone compared to The Sixth Sense. I'm sure that's what caused it to not necessarily be in the public's favoring eye here.
I think so. Well, we are going to discuss it right now. We are going to get into spoiler territory for Unbreakable. So if you haven't seen Unbreakable and you don't want it to be spoiled for you, you want to go in spoiler free, go ahead and click pause right now. Go watch it, come back and click play, and we'll be ready to talk about it. David Dunn, played by Bruce Willis, is your average guy. He's got a wife and a son. He works as a security guard at a football stadium. Oh, and he's the sole survivor of a massive train crash. On top of that, his life is falling apart. He's leaving his wife Audrey, played by Robin Wright Penn, and his son, played by Spencer Treat Clark, to hopefully take a job in New York, which is quite the distance from where they live in Philadelphia. Although after the train crash, his wife and son begin to reconsider how much they really do care about him, and he does likewise. Surprisingly, a third party is taking interest in David as well. A Mr. Elijah Price, played by Samuel L. Jackson, who runs Limited Edition, a comic book art gallery. He believes David to be none other than a superhero, considering he's never been sick, can bench press 350 pounds, which is way over what he should be able to do, and he walked away from a fatal car crash with not a scratch on him, and a fatal train crash. Believing Elijah to be insane, he leaves hoping never to see him again. Except Elijah keeps popping up in David's life and eventually Audrey's life when he must see her for physical therapy after breaking numerous bones. See, Elijah has a rare genetic disorder causing massive fragility with his bones. Unsurprisingly, the kids at school, when he was a child, gave him the nickname Mr. Glass. More and more, David begins to reevaluate his life circumstances. By all means, David shouldn't be walking, let alone living, after all he's gone through. Nevertheless, he's healthy as a horse and has incredible intuition as to what people are hiding. Taking Elijah, aka Mr. Glass, up on his prompt to test his extra sense of peering into people's true natures and then doing something about it, he literally stumbles upon a maintenance worker at a train station who is a psychotic. He has a family bound and tortured in their home, with their father murdered. David follows him to the home and successfully defeats him, while preserving his identity. Only does he let his son in on the secret. Later, David meets up with Mr. Glass at his art exposition, where they shake hands, finally as friends. Except when David shakes Glass's hand, he's presented with horrible flashes of Glass planting incendiary devices on planes, trains, and in hotels, revealing Philadelphia's greatest tragedies have all been his doing. Mr. Glass did so in order to flush out a hero, his antitype. If there is someone completely unbreakable, the opposite of Glass's fragility, then he must serve a purpose, that of the supervillain. Deeply saddened by this startling revelation, David turns Glass into the authorities, where he is locked away in an asylum for the criminally insane, as credits roll. And I should mention, we don't see him get locked away. Like, every superhero movie pretty much ends with the bad guy, like, they show him being locked away, but this one takes, once again, more realistic approach. We'll talk about whether that realistic approach really works or not. But yeah, for the most part, a superhero type origin story that's more so completely just grounded in reality.
Yeah, I think you got it right. For the most part, they grounded in reality. There are some kind of very mild supernatural elements to it. Mr. Glass's or Elijah's condition is a real thing. Now, on the opposite side, I don't think that Bruce Willis's or David Dunn's condition, where he pretty much can't die, is not necessarily as much of a thing as Elijah's condition.
I don't think so.
But they play off in a way where, like, it's not necessarily real, but it does end up working for the movie for the most part. There are a couple of things that we'll probably get into a bit later that I don't think work all that well, but for the most part, in my opinion, I think that the realistic elements that they have here definitely work for what they're going for.
Yeah, the film questions, what if there is some average Joe among us who has never realized his potential? He's just forgotten about past circumstances or excused them, or his brain has kind of covered them up or changed them in such a way as to rationalize them. So in that sense, it's interesting. But the movie doesn't open up with our protagonist, David. Well, wait, does it? No, it does.
No, it opens up with
that's right.
Elijah when he's being born.
So that was really...
Which is all kinds of interesting, because you never really start... You don't usually start off with the villain right away.
Yeah.
Which at the time, you don't really know that he's a villain.
And without us even realizing it, this is also a villain's origin story as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting that they start off even on opposite ends, because when Elijah is born, there's a doctor, or maybe a man who is, I guess, in training. I suppose he's a doctor. They don't really explicitly say if he is, but he comes in and holds the baby and says, "You need to get this baby into a hospital right away. He has fractures on his arms and legs." Cut to Bruce Willis on the train, and then not long after talking with the lady, there's a train wreck, and he comes out unscathed. So already we have this divide between these two characters before we really get into the story of one is very fragile and one pretty much can't be killed, aside from what we find out later is his weakness as water.
Yes, it's a good dichotomy that we're introduced to here. Now, it's a little odd. The opening shot is an overlay of comic book statistics. It really doesn't do anything to serve the purpose of the story, except to just, I guess, make the audience realize how big comic books are, I guess, to people.
And I'm sure those numbers have definitely inflated since this movie's been released, so I can guarantee you these statistics are way out of date.
It'd be interesting to know the statistic nowadays, but the film does begin in 1961, like Alan said, with the very fragile, broken baby, whose mom calls him Elijah. She has him in a department store, which seemed really odd for some reason. But I do gotta say, I love the opening shot. We are actually watching everything through a mirror.
Right. And that seems to become a trope with at least Elijah's early life. We always see him in some kind of reflection for most of the time. And this scene, opening with this scene, is a reflection of, for most of the scene, which does go on for quite a long time in terms of not really cutting. We see it most of it through a reflection in the glass.
Yeah.
I'm kind of taking it as, and it does kind of help reiterate this later on when we come back to these flashbacks, that Elijah's life and his mom isn't exactly in, I guess, the more profitable side of society here. They're kind of on the lower end of the socioeconomic pole here, which would be explained to me why they were in the back of a department store. But at the same time, we also get this visual, which we don't really realize until much later, that the baby, or Elijah, is an extremely fragile person. And usually when you look into a reflection, typically that's a symbolic representation of a person looking at the opposite of themselves if they're staring into a mirror and looking inwardly, which is, we will come to find out, we will find later, is David Dunn, who does have the complete opposite condition that he has. So here in this opening, it kind of presents this idea, and then later on, when his mom says, "I have a present for you outside," when he's looking through the TV, you definitely get this idea that he's searching for something. His search beginning here as a kid. What if there's somebody different or the opposite of who I am? Which I think is very interesting to really focus a lot of time on a villain like this.
It is surprising, and I was kind of debating with this. I'm thinking this is almost just as much of Elijah's story as it is David's story, and I'm like, right. In fact, and that's why I was actually a little confused, because the new movie that just came out this year, Glass, is, well, clearly focused on Elijah, right. But we do have so much focus on him, and even starting the movie with him makes me think, is this Elijah's movie more so? I'm like, why aren't we getting more so a Bruce Willis-centered movie? But we are. They do kind of give almost equal screen time. I won't say it's completely equal, because I do think Willis's screen time wins out in the end, but it's close. We do get to understand Glass pretty well.
Yeah. And I would say it makes sense to focus on David more, because while it is kind of in the realm of only being, or not really only being, but it is kind of in the realm of this is Elijah's story. It's Elijah's pursuit of finding his opposite self, which is David's. Yeah. So it would just make kind of sense storytelling-wise to focus a lot of time on David than we would have on Elijah.
Yeah, I know M. Night Shyamalan gave a quote during this movie, kind of this yin-yang Star Wars, the Force, there's the light side, there's the dark side. Good and evil can't exist without one another, which is not true. Right. But nevertheless, that's clearly what Shyamalan is going for in this movie, is if there's evil, then there has to be good, which is true. Right. But evil is not necessary.
Right.
And it is interesting that we open with a completely broken baby, which calls into question the title Unbreakable. And I'm thinking, well, certainly not this baby is not unbreakable, but it does get you
almost immediately intrigued. There's a disconnect between the title and what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. And it does just fade into the opening credits. And I do love the theme for this movie that James Newton Howard scored.
Yeah, James Newton Howard, I think I mentioned this in the previous Sixth Sense podcast. Great composer. Really enjoy his stuff. And both of these movies have really shown off how good of a composer he is. Because I don't think there's really any track in any of these movies that he's composed so far that really don't work and don't do anything aside from really help the movie out.
Oh, I definitely agree. But when we do get to Bruce Willis's character, the way he is initially filmed, it's so good. It's just so interesting. Where this camera just kind of like pans back and forth between the seats like it's a little kid watching him.
Oh, yeah. We're definitely taking on the eyes of a child here with this scene.
Right. And taking on the eyes of a child for the first time we see Willis is interesting because children are often associated with loving superheroes. It's mostly children who do love superheroes. And when they first see superheroes, they're always in awe, and superheroes is just kind of a paragon of integrity and righteousness. Well, he's not. He is clearly wanting to be unfaithful to his wife, and he's a little creepy with how he's flirting with this lady and staring at her weird stomach tattoo. And so you get the sense like this guy has a lot of character flaws. He is not what I would think of as a hero to his family, and especially considering Elijah comes from a single parent household, and it seems like Willis is about to repeat that process with his family.
Yeah, it's very interesting that this movie begins with two kind of opposite characters, at least of what you would expect from a hero and villain. It seems like the movie's almost already betraying itself before it has even really began, which is very, very interesting to me in my mind. Just the way that they present these characters. Not only is Bruce Willis unfaithful, but he has plenty of character flaws. You can tell just by the way he talks and the way that he's moving and the way the camera lingers on him taking off his ring that his marriage isn't exactly in a state where is, I guess you could say, acceptable. It's not necessarily in the best state it could be. There is definitely some hurt between them, and we haven't even seen the wife yet. And you do kind of get this idea that maybe he has a wife and a kid at home, seeing this whole scene through the eyes of a child, which at the same time is a pretty long opening introductory scene for our main character. I don't think it isn't cut for a long time. I think it's a good maybe 3 or 4 minutes of these two characters going back and forth, and it kind of showing these two characters to the separation in the seats in front of them.
Yeah, it shows he's not really any example worthy of imitation.
Right.
But then we're presumed there's some kind of incident with how everything goes wide and everybody knows something is wrong. And then we cut to his son. We don't know it's his son at first, but his son, who's named Joseph. And it's interesting to note that Shyamalan seems to have a propensity to making children kind of stars in the movie. They do play prominent roles.
Right.
Clearly, I think Haley Joel Osment has a bigger role in this than Spencer Treat Clark. But it's interesting. They both have 3 names. It is true. And I did want to jump into Spencer Treat Clark's history just for a minute, because it is interesting. Haley Joel Osment was quite the star around that time, like I said, and Spencer Treat Clark was as well. He would also come out that year in a little movie called Gladiator.
Have you even heard of it?
Yeah, it's not many people heard of that Best Picture winner. That was a huge movie, but he did play a fairly prominent part in Gladiator, and 3 years later, he would star in another Oscar-winning film, including Best Picture nominee, Mystic River, and which stars Robin Wright Penn's husband. So, connection there. Huh. Yeah, but nevertheless, there's kind of these like really famous child stars that really didn't do anything with their career. I mean, they're both acting today, but just not in really big roles. But judging by, jumping back to the train crash, judging by it, everybody is dead. That kind of train crash, you gotta be dead.
Yeah, everyone except for 2 people, which ends up just being one, after we see David wake up in the hospital. It's actually a really cool scene having the last guy alive kind of die right in front of David.
Yeah.
It does kind of bring up the question, what were they thinking, but whatever. It is a cool shot to see how the doctor comes in and talks to him and says, yeah, there are only 2 survivors, you and that man over there, but that man isn't going to last very long. And we see him like kind of struggling. These 2 doctors are already working on this guy and, in the foreground that's out of focus. And then it is kind of interesting too, because the camera begins to push inward towards Bruce Willis and the doctor. So it pulls our focus away from this man who's already dying and into our main character, Bruce Willis, which I think is just very, very interesting. Once again, by a visual standpoint.
Yes, this is one of the first shots that we get that does make it feel like a comic book, where everything is kind of squared just like a panel on a comic book would be squared, and everything is kind of centered in the frame in order to draw our eyes first to David, but then we realize what is going on in the foreground of the scene. So it's interesting we're able to interact with both of them. A comic book would more so... a comic book may be framed like this, but a comic book is able to kind of cut back and forth between these two things. But it's kind of like giving us two panels in one. We get the panel in the foreground and the panel in the background. So I do love the shot right here.
Oh, yeah. This is a very, very good shot. Just a very good scene in general that they have here. Yes. This is one of the things that when I was watching it again, I was like, oh, crap. Like I remember being pulled in because it's very well done. The way that they pull this off is extremely well done, to convey a lot of different information, because you do find out later that it is kind of hard for Bruce Willis to just kind of die like that. And even here, how he was like the only survivor on the train and had no scratches on him at all. It is kind of starting this idea that this man might be the opposite of what we were seeing earlier. There tend to be a lot of contrasts in this movie, which makes sense because a lot of superhero comics always have, and they kind of mention this, they have varying contrasts where it's pretty much just good versus evil. The two direct contrasts as far as opposites as you can get coming together and fighting each other.
Something that I think is really fascinating is the color palette in this movie is just kind of almost a lot of grays, a lot of muted colors, which seems to designate in real life, if there were really superheroes, there is a lot of gray areas as to their viewpoints and even their personal lives, how they came to be. So the only real contrast we get is, like you were saying, is David is more so in green, which kind of is his superhero color, and Mr. Glass is in purple, which did kind of make me think of the Joker, especially Jack Nicholson's version, which came out 11 years prior. So clearly having a purple color like that, a cane, these gloves, even his hair, he does kind of cut a menacing figure, or at least something kind of foreboding or imposing. Right.
Yeah. There is definitely some kind of some foreboding emotions that are being presented whenever he puts on that purple suit. I mean, you kind of, with his introductory scene where he kicks the guy out of his art gallery because he's going to give this piece to his kid, his 4-year-old kid named Jeb. It kind of begins, because at this point it's pretty obvious that this is the character of Elijah, just grown up now. But it is interesting that we do get to see, I guess, his more evil side, more or less, of him. But for the most part, and really for all of the movie aside from maybe the ending, he doesn't really come off as like an evil guy. Just a man looking for somebody who's the opposite of him, because that's what he feels his life calling is right now, is to find that opposite person to who he is, which is interesting. I guess I probably should also bring up a little bit of color theory here in terms of the two characters, because you mentioned that David Dunn's character is, especially when he's doing superhero-y things, he's dressed in green, which usually represents self-growth. Yes. And then you've also got purple, which is what Mr. Glass usually typically wears, and that tends to represent royalty and certain things like that. Now, a lot of purple could also begin to represent sadness, and darker purple can also represent the same thing. But there seems to be like a neutral purple. It's more royalty. He does sell very expensive art, comic book art, I guess you could say. So yeah, he I guess it would go to explain that he's been searching his whole life for this, has built up, I guess, this kind of empire to him as an art gallery, and then now he is trying to find who is his exact opposite. That's what his whole life has kind of been leading up to, he feels.
Yes, and when the two do meet at limited edition, we get some kind of interesting scenes. I mean, I guess before that, we do have another flashback to West Philadelphia in 1974, where Elijah is 13 years old and he's afraid of getting his body broken again, and the kids at school call him Mr. Glass. It's not cool to do something like that, but I mean, that nickname is a little cool sounding.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Gotta admit, of all the names. But anyways, I do really like this scene as well, not just for its technical aspects, but giving us kind of that incentive along the road. It's a little interesting to see that Elijah is in some ways kind of this anti-savior, almost this antichrist, because he was born with just this mom, which could possibly evoke the Virgin Mary. Jesus was born in a stable. He was born in the back of a department store. Right. We also only have an account of when Jesus was, I don't know, roughly around the age of 13. We get that of Glass here as well, except he's not a really a wise kid. Like, Jesus could have been considered kind of this prominent child. He's more so one that wants to go hide. And this is where he kind of realizes his potential growing up is, I'm not really a savior of the world. I could be kind of the evil figure of this world. So I do kind of see there is kind of this sort of antichrist parallel here that I think kind of works really in an interesting way.
Yeah, and I would even go as far as to say that the names, especially for the main characters here, are pulled from, I would say, they seem to insinuate some biblical representation, like Elijah as a prophet in the Old Testament. David, yes. I mean, that could be a couple of things, like David the Archangel, or David and Goliath, or whatever. Joseph is definitely a biblical name. So now I don't think that they necessarily connect with their biblical counterparts, but they are biblical names, and I don't think that was a mistake.
Yeah, in more of an archetypal fashion, they connect fairly well, because Jesus was of the line of David, and Jesus was essentially the perfect human in a way, and David is supposed to be that, so we can kind of see David as kind of that lineage, at least in an archetype form. And yeah, Elijah, like you said, was a prophet of the Old Testament. Also, the compound name Eli means God. So he is, we see the potential. And I think that's what's really fascinating is the first time I saw this, I never suspected he was going to be this psychotic mass murderer.
Right.
I never suspected it. But upon second viewing, all of the breadcrumbs are there. If you rewatch it, you can tell, okay, well, they're kind of actually setting him up to be the opposite, the villain of this movie. That's kind of obvious, actually. But nevertheless, I believe he does have the potential for good throughout this whole movie until the very end.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and typical, at least so far, in Shyamalan fashion with his twists, they're not out of nowhere. The whole movie kind of builds up to him. Now, I think that the Sixth Sense twist is definitely a better one, but don't get me wrong. I think that this also, even though it is a twist that could come out of nowhere, it isn't one. They do play up this idea from the very beginning that he was the one who kind of isn't all sane as we may have expected from, at least from his introduction as an adult. So, and I like the fact that it doesn't just stem from him, I just want to find the opposite of me. It stems from essentially his birth, from when he was born until the moment he's at the very end when he's apprehended by the police. He's kind of been developing this idea of, can I find somebody who is the opposite of me, which does especially kickstart when his mom gives him the comic. And essentially from then on, his entire life has been devoted to finding the opposite of who he really is.
When you think about it, it's really sad that he kind of resigns himself to this fate of, if I'm kind of this no good, worthless guy, there's nothing I can do except be broken all the time, then there's got to be somebody who's a hero, a man of steel that can do all of these things. So he's like, okay, from now on, I'm just going to be a supervillain. So he just grows up to devise ways of causing horrible disasters, just causing untold thousands of lives to be lost, all in his very selfish pursuit vindicating his own beliefs or thoughts about the reason for his condition in life.
Right. And it's also interesting too because without Elijah, David may have never realized, I guess, what his true calling in life is. He never would have realized the condition that he has, which is he's unbreakable. It's interesting that it's Elijah's fault that he is the one who kind of sets him on this track of, I guess, becoming this hero in the very end.
Now, one of the flaws that I do have with this movie is when they do start to encounter each other and Elijah causes David to question his past. I just can't believe David has never realized he's been sick in his life. Yeah. And even his wife is like, you know what? I never thought about that you've never been sick. Are you kidding me?
Right. I could maybe make the excuse that you would just kind of get used to it after a while, but that's not much of an excuse. Yeah, it is, I guess, a logical flaw that he would just never have noticed himself getting sick, never would have known what it means to be, I guess, in bed or even with the cold, aside from, I guess, one time when he had pneumonia because he almost drowned, which we find out later is his weakness. So, yeah, I think it would be rather strange. And realistically, him being in bed with pneumonia may have killed him. I think I mentioned that, but it probably should have killed him because there would be, like, no immune system to that kind of a thing. Aside from that, though, it is interesting that they just never noticed until Elijah puts the note on his windshield that he's never been sick. It is... at that point, you are kind of asking for a lot there.
Yeah, you're asking for a lot, and also just a series of events. They said he nearly drowned when he was a child. He was in a car wreck, and now a train crash. He just doesn't really ever think anything of it. He just goes on with his life. Right. Really? After all those events?
Right. Yeah, it just, at least with the car wreck, it would seem like, oh, he's super, super lucky to not have a scratch on him. Like, to a considerable degree, that's very strange. But yeah, it is the train wreck that really causes this whole mess to begin. Now, to be fair, I think what Shyamalan is going for is definitely this man trying to find, I guess, purpose in his life. He is a middle-aged man, as we can probably clearly see here, so I would go on the fence to say that at the moment we see, that at the moment this movie begins, David Dunn is under some kind of midlife crisis, because his family is kind of falling apart. He's definitely separated from his wife, while still living in the same household. He's kind of trying to connect with the son, but it isn't really working out too well. He is even highly considering moving to New York to live by himself for a job there, just to kind of get away from everything and maybe even start everything all over again. So he's kind of in this like bad area of his life, and this whole movie is him realizing what it means to be a true hero, or what it means to have some kind of purpose in life. Because that seems to be a running theme here, is self-purpose, or finding some kind of, I guess, some self-realization here. So I would say that's what he was going for, and that would be what causes some of these logical errors to come up, is him trying to keep this allegory here alive.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can understand that. He kind of is coming to terms with everything that has gone through with him. Yeah. The one scene that I don't think works is when he's at his school because his son was fighting, and the lady was like, oh, we still tell stories about you to keep the kids away from the pool or whatever. And it's just a slow zoom of him like pretty much starting to cry, and just realize, I guess, that he has gone through all of this stuff. I just don't think the emotion was there. Like, it just felt so forced. Because I just caught myself like, wait, why is he crying, and why are we getting the slow zoom like it's some crazy Sixth Sense revelation? Okay.
Right. At least it is setting up that he does have a weakness, And at first he thinks that's proof that I don't have this power that you think I do when he's talking to glass.
Yeah.
But we do kind of find out later that he does still have this power. It's just that water is his weakness. Without, I guess, being submerged underwater is what could cause him to die, which is how he gets pneumonia and then almost drowned that day. But yeah, the emotion is, I guess, kind of missing here in this one scene.
Yeah.
Although it does make sense a bit later on as to why it even exists in the first place. But yeah.
One of the other things I think is an incredible stretch is when they're talking with Elijah and he says comics are a way of passing on history like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and he's got a big tablet of one behind him. Like, really?
Yeah.
Why? No, they're not the same at all, honestly.
It's definitely a visual thing.
Right. I guess so, but yeah, that one's just kind of ridiculous. I found that to be really ridiculous. Now, comic books present archetypes of ancient figures that we kind of can connect throughout world history, but nevertheless, this comic books are not a way of passing on history like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And he's like, oh, well, the original comic books were. Today, they're just all trashy and commercialized, but back then, they weren't. No, I don't believe it. That just seems like Shyamalan trying to be a little too deep than what the movie warrants.
Yeah. One could also chalk that up to, the villain not having a sane mindset to a lot of things as well. I'll agree with you. It looks weird from a visual standpoint to just all of a sudden show this giant slab with a bunch of hieroglyphics on the back of it.
Yeah.
It's weird from a visual standpoint, but I can probably get on board in terms of showing, because usually when you have a protagonist and antagonist, they share a similar goal, if not the same goal. But they go about it in completely different ways. Typically you would see the antagonist going about it in more of an unethical way, whereas the, protagonist would go about it in a sound way, but with plenty of flaws that he must overcome before he eventually realizes how to proceed with this belief in a better way or whatever. It could be, that's usually what happens in a story like this.
One of the scenes that I do like from this movie that is pretty kind of cringe-worthy, actually, not in like a bad way, but in like, wow, that does hurt to watch it, is when Elijah is chasing the guy with the gun down the stairs, and when he does fall and his bones do break, and I gotta say, I love the visual of his glass cane shattering, and then his bones are so hard hitting. That scene really does like make you feel like, yeah, that does really hurt. Except Sam Jackson's face, the final scene doesn't quite sell the pain.
Yeah, you definitely get to see, especially now, up front and personal, how fragile he really is. Because up until this point, it's really only been like after the fact of his injuries. So at this point, we do get to see how fragile he really is falling down the stairs, and how stairs are kind of, I guess, one of his weaknesses as well. But I love the camera work in here too, because the camera is like slowly rotates, and goes pretty much completely upside down as the man with the camo jacket hops over, I guess, the terminal, and you get to see the glimpse upside down still of the gun with the silver handle that he has, that David had visualized that he had in his belt pocket, and I guess hooked to his belt. So I love, even from a visual and cinematic standpoint, how this scene looks. Really, this whole movie looks really great. I think it might be so far the best looking Shyamalan movie that we have, with The Sixth Sense, once again, not very far behind it.
No, yeah, I would agree with that. One of probably the most fun, memorable scenes, though, is testing how much David can bench press.
Yeah.
I remember that from the first time I saw it, and it's a really fun scene. It's funny how his son is standing in the background, like his dad's like, stand back just in case you like crush your body or something, and your like body explodes or something.
Right.
And he's like, what do you do? Get mom. It's just a funny scene, and of course the lines about, do you think you could beat Bruce Lee? That is, once again, Shyamalan's kind of witty writing coming out. And I would say in each movie he's done so far, there's been something really clever that he's placed in the scene that didn't necessarily need to be there, but just enhance the scene.
Right, yeah. And this is one of the few scenes I do, for whatever reason, I still remember. This scene, most notably the scene that happens not too long after this, I think. There are just a number of scenes here that, for whatever reason, have just stuck in my mind since whenever I watched it in high school. And I've never really been able to shake it. This is kind of one of those scenes, but later on, when the son pulls the gun on the dad, and then...
Oh, yep.
The scene... I think it's at the very end. At the very end, the very ending scene is also one that it's the wife scene when he walks into, I think this actually happens early on. He walks into the closet and pulls out like this, folder with all the news clippings in it. Oh, really? And then he has the conversation with his wife right after that. That whole sequence, for whatever reason, I still remember that sequence. Almost line for line for some strange reason. I don't know why I like it so much, but from a visual standpoint, it looks really, really good. And then it also helps set up the beginnings of a repair with his wife and their relationship.
That is one of the other memorable scenes, is Joseph's experiment of shooting his dad.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I saw it, I found it to be extremely frightening. It almost was horrific, I would say, and extremely intense. I will say it's not as intense the second time around.
Yeah. But
I will say it is one of the best uses of a handheld camera I've ever seen.
Yeah. Yeah, they definitely do sell the intensity, especially with the camera work in this scene. It's interesting. I want to say that Joseph has some autism in him, because I think that they mentioned that at one point in the movie.
Really?
I could be very wrong about that. But that for whatever reason, I was wondering if that be the reason why Joseph ends up pulling the gun and does kind of some, I guess, dramatic things here. I could be so wrong about that, so don't take my word for it. But anyways.
I don't know. I just took it as he just wants to prove to his dad. He knows his dad is unbreakable.
Oh, yeah.
He's invincible. Bullets can't stop Superman, so why would they stop his dad? And he's like, this is going to be the ultimate litmus test.
Yeah.
And it's a little funny, the dialogue in there. He's like, Joseph, if you don't put the gun down, I'm going to abandon you for good.
Yeah. And my favorite line, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but the mom does say, the mom says, don't shoot friends, Joseph. I don't know if that was supposed to be as funny as it was, but it is kind of hilarious.
Yeah, she's probably piggybacking off of what David said, because he was like, we're starting to become friends, and friends don't shoot each other. And then the mom was like, yeah, we don't shoot friends, okay? Put the gun down. That was funny. I will say Robin Wright Penn is fairly weak in this scene. She doesn't really sell me on, like, I mean, for Pete's sake, if a child's pointing a gun at somebody, you're gonna be extremely, like, on edge, and she's just more so like, hey, quit it.
Yeah.
Or you're gonna be in trouble.
I'm gonna be honest, I don't really like Aubrey's character in this story, or at least the actor that plays her. I don't think she does the best job compared to anybody else here. I think that she, while still does a good job in a few scenes, I think that she's more of the weaker actresses that is in this movie, or actors that's in this movie for me.
She's definitely the weak link as far as acting goes. Now, I mean, I think her character is fine, but the way she's portrayed, she doesn't really sell me on anything. The one time that I guess I liked her the most was when she first came up to his room, and she was like, I kind of want to start over again with you.
Right.
This train crash really put into perspective, our relationship. And I love the line, if you want to ask me out sometime, I'd be okay with that. So that's the one time I really like her. Otherwise, she's almost a non-factor in this movie, and she doesn't need to be a big part.
Yeah, no, and I would say that her character is absolutely important for this scene, and there are don't get me wrong, there are scenes where she definitely works, like the scene when she talks to him in the closet. That scene, I think she really works in there, because she asked him, have you been, seeing anybody else? And he says no, and then she begins crying, and she kind of lets out that maybe we can start over. Like, I really enjoy that scene. I think she does a really good job there. And the scene maybe a little bit later on when they go on a date, I think she does a good job there too, as well. There are a few scenes here where she does very, very well, and I find that there's no way you could have a movie about a man trying to repair his life without her in there somewhere. So she's absolutely imperative, but I do kind of wish that the actress that portrayed her, I guess portrayed her in a bit of a different way, because I don't know if it's the way that she acts or what, but it isn't grabbing me in other scenes than the ones that I find to be very impactful, like the closet scene or whatever.
Yes, I would agree. Now, did you notice Shyamalan's cameo?
I did, yes. He is the drug dealer in the stadium.
Yes, he plays stadium drug dealer, and it's pretty funny that I just wasn't expecting him to be the one David pats down at the stadium. He's like, Hey, sir, what do you got on your person there? And he's like, oh, nothing. What do you want from me, huh? I do enjoy seeing Shyamalan's cameos. It makes me think he's kind of the new Hitchcock, where Hitchcock always had a fun cameo, never as big of parts, never speaking roles or as big of parts as Shyamalan. But nevertheless, it's a fun part in the movie. Yeah.
Hitchcock is more along the lines of you have to really look for him to find him. Shyamalan is not very hard to spot because he has some kind of acting role in his movies, at least so far the two that we've had. And he has a main role in his first one. But yeah, it's not very hard to try and find Shyamalan as long as you know what he looks like. He is pretty easy to spot because he has speaking lines. So,
one of the scenes that seems kind of out of place or just unnecessary, it is a funny scene, but I don't really know what we're supposed to get out of it, is where Elijah is at the comic book store and he's just sitting there and the guy wants to close up and then he starts wheeling him down the aisles and then Elijah will purposely knock himself into there. To me, that just seems like he's like, I've given up hope. I'm just going to go to a comic book shop and be a little destructive and rebellious. It's funny, but I don't know. What do we get out of that? Where does it go?
To be fair, the scene that happened before this, David says to Elijah, for like the third time, I think he's been told this, just leave my family alone.
Right.
And even though Elijah tries to call him out for his car wreck, saying, you didn't actually get hurt in that car wreck, you faked it or whatever, David decides not to listen to him. So I would say it's more of him giving up on life, and he goes to the comic book store maybe to search for some kind of inspiration, because originally his inspiration was from the comic book he got from his mom. So my guess is he's there at the comic book store more to do with him kind of sulking and looking kind of for some pick me up, which he does eventually find after running into the stands after the guy tries to kick him out. So that would be why it would make sense for him to be in the comic book store. Although it is a little bit strange that this scene does exist where the guy tries to kick him out and he runs into stands and stuff. So
yeah,
I'll meet you halfway.
I guess it just felt a little disconnected because he said, I'm going to call the police, and I assume we never see him call the police. So I just don't really know what happened after that. I don't know. And I guess I can say the other thing is, if the police did pick this guy up and they did like charge him or something, he would be on their records. And well, I'll wait to save the end for last, like how he's able to get away with all these crimes and not be, not get away with it for so long, anyways.
Right.
But we do also. I was a little surprised we got a flashback of young David and young Audrey with the car wreck. It wasn't completely necessary to have that for a flashback, but the guy who did play young David, I thought he looked pretty close to him. The guy's name is... Yeah, that really surprised me how similar he looked to Bruce Willis, but just much younger. Yeah, it's kind of funny. Young David Dunn is played by Davis Duffield. So a little similar there with their names. Yeah. I wouldn't completely discount this scene because it's kind of... Now,
well, I'll get to that in a sec, but it has been building up to the fact that, hey, he has actually gotten hurt before, and this car wreck was one of those times when he actually got hurt.
Mm-hmm.
But we do find out earlier from Elijah that may not exactly be true. He may have just done it just so he could stop playing football, because we do know that Audrey does not like football at all.
Right.
And that kind of makes sense because she's a physical therapist. But, so there's a car wreck that they get into, and we come to find out that not only is he unscathed, but he is absolutely super strong, because he's able to rip the door off of the car, off of the overturned car, and save Audrey at the time before they got married. And that's what he does to get away from football, is through this car wreck. So it's not like this scene is more of him coming to the realization that he does have these powers for real, and it's been with him his whole life. And even in this scene, which I guess he may have convinced himself that he actually did get injured, in reality he did not get injured. Now, to be fair, though, I don't know if we necessarily need the visual aspect to this scene to, I guess, get what they're trying to say, that, you know, it has been with him his whole life, and that really the scene only serves its purpose to show as a visual that, hey, he has had this his whole life, and that he used it when he didn't even know that he had it. Now, on a realistic standpoint, it could just be the adrenaline rushing through him, which has been noted to, for people to be lifting cars, although that is very unpopular that this kind of thing happens.
Well, anyways, but the thing that did throw me off a little bit was the lady looks nothing like Audrey that he pulls from the car.
Yeah. The younger version, not as close as Bruce Willis's younger version.
We do get to the climax here fairly quickly, I would say, where Glass tells him, he's like, basically, go prove yourself. Go looking for someone. Like, trust your, essentially Spidey senses, and you'll find somebody worthy of you to kind of stop. And I do like this scene because he's in like a very darkly lit world, but when he does bump into people, he is able to see their illicit activities from the viewpoint of almost a security camera, which makes sense because he is a security guard. And the evil people do have colors on them, such as usually kind of more slimy colors like red and orange, and maybe some more sickly tones of that as well. The one that did surprise me the most is, of course, the orange suit man, who is kind of this psychotic BTK figure who does literally bind, torture, and kill this family. And once again, Shyamalan does a good job of horrifying me. I did certain elements horrifying in The Sixth Sense, but this whole climax is something that I won't forget either, because of just how truly terrifying it is. There's this guy working as just a maintenance man, but he goes home and he's this total psychotic.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you are correct that pretty much anybody who's bad, or anybody that Bruce Willis can kind of see their illicit activities, have more color to them than everybody else does. Everybody else is pretty muted. They're like browns and maybe some greens in there somewhere. But once a bad person bumps into David, like the girl with the red jacket on, you kind of get this quick image that she's kind of abusive toward her child. Or M. Night himself, as playing the drug dealer, was wearing a pretty lighter blue jacket than anybody else was. So yeah, everybody here has a highlighted color towards them if they're a bad person. And we do kind of find out that it is no mistake that Glass is also wearing something other than a muted color. He's wearing purple. And up until the scene the very end, when he does shake his hand and he realizes that he was the one who caused everything, all the bad things, all these terrorist acts that happened. It's kind of been under our nose this whole time, that Mr. Glass here is also on that crowd, which also explains why he is wearing a color, that is different from pretty much anybody else in the story that's like an extra in the background.
I do like it when he does free the family and he does fight off this guy, and especially because every superhero movie, especially every origin story, they have to fight some kind of entry-level boss. If that makes sense. Yeah. Usually the sequels are saved for something bigger. And of course that is the case because it does seem like in Glass, Willis will fight James McAvoy's character, the Beast, which is a much bigger super villain, you could say. But Shyamalan also brings our expectations down from that of a supernatural villain to, honestly, something much more terrifying. Like I said, this psychotic home invasion guy. And it's interesting that it's not what you would expect, a lot of punching and kicking. He mostly just chokes him out. And so it's not really that violent of a scene. And Willis is not really the aggressor per se. Now, when he does fall into the pool and the camera's flipping with him and then he sees everything kind of coming around him, I don't really feel a whole lot of intensity, and I don't really feel like that's his kryptonite per se. It's just like, anybody would kind of drown in a pool like that. That'd be really difficult to get yourself out of, but he is aided by those girls. So that one scene of like, our character, Superman has to deal with the kryptonite at least once during his fight. To me, I didn't really buy that as much.
Yeah. And this is kind of defined in the last movie, The Sixth Sense, where the main lead realizes the power that they have, and then they go on to begin using that power in this final scene here. Because in The Sixth Sense, they realized, he saw one of the ghosts, the ghouly figures that were in that movie, and then helps her out. And in this scene, or in this movie, Bruce Willis realizes his power and the power that he has, and goes and uses it for good to save this family from this burglar who has kind of taken over the home. So, this is nothing new to Shyamalan. He kind of defined this in his last movie. And it also serves to show Bruce Willis not only figuring out his powers, but also figuring out how easy he can be taken down, which is he being pushed into the pool. And maybe pool covers have come a long way, but typically pool covers now are latched to the ground, so this wouldn't happen if something fell on top of it.
Yeah.
I mean, his weakness is water, and he's kind of being engulfed by he's being engulfed by not only the mat, but also the mat in conjunction with the water. Luckily, he is saved by the kids, though. So I felt it. I think that it was more to do with the setup of him realizing his powers and having to find a way to execute those powers, but he's still very much an amateur at what he does. I like this scene. It is, once again, kind of typical Shyamalan, where the scene that happens, that he realizes his power doesn't necessarily have much to... The scene, the setting itself does not necessarily have anything to do with the story itself, aside from the hero of the story being the one who realizes their powers and is able to show that they can, in fact, do what their sole purpose is, or find their self-worth, and this is how they do it. This is, once again, kind of the same thing as Sixth Sense. They're very similar in this aspect.
Something else I do love is he's not just a hero by fighting bad guys, but he's also a hero in his own home. And I think that showcased nicely with carrying Audrey up the stairs with no sweat whatsoever. It looks a little awkward how it's filmed, but nevertheless, it is a neat scene, and she's shocked because, if it's not easy to carry a human being like that, let alone up a flight of stairs, but he does it with such ease. And that shows he's like just truly given over to his powers as just a protector and also as a father. So the reconciliation is good. And I've come to appreciate that with the Shyamalan films we've seen so far. There is some solid reconciliation or redemption of the characters at the end.
Yeah, this movie is more so than Sixth Sense. This movie is heavily under that idea of a man seeking redemption for a life that he, and at the beginning, seems to resent. So, which makes sense. Like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like a midlife crisis for this man, and he kind of comes to terms with who he really is. That's really the whole point of the movie, is him coming to terms of who he really is, finding out what his true purpose is in life. A little bit late than what you would typically expect. But yeah, this scene, although it is kind of strange, I wonder if they had Audrey on some kind of rig that didn't make her move around so much. It really does look like that.
They definitely did.
Yeah. This is pretty much the scene that defines that their relationship, and pretty much everything in the household has been resolved. He's been able to redeem and reconnect with both his wife and his child at this point. It definitely does work on, especially a redemption arc. This is pretty much the end of his redemption arc here, is that he's fixed everything with his wife. That was kind of the bigger things between the three of them in the household, is repairing that relationship with his wife, which they spend a lot of time on.
And I did really like it. Now, of course, we can't wrap up the film without Mr. Glass.
Ah, yes.
Where we get this completely startling revelation that he has been the mass murderer. He's been the terrorist, more or less. Now, were you surprised by this ending when you first saw it, Alan?
I think so. It's been years since I've seen it, when I first watched it. So I think I was surprised by this ending, that it turns out Elijah Price is the actual villain and he caused all these terrorist acts. Mm-hmm. I want to say yes. I can't exactly give you a clear answer, though.
I think it's a great reveal. It's kind of the icing on the cake, actually. I would have been fine with him not being bad, which makes me kind of sad, because I was like, oh man, they just became friends, and I kind of liked him, and it really does kind of reveal his true nature that was always lurking underneath. And he gives this really good line at the end where he says, now that we know who you are, now I know who I am. I'm not a mistake. I should have known because of the kids. They called me Mr. Glass, which is just a villain sounding name. So a really good line, but definitely starting, and I think the emotion is played just right, especially from Bruce Willis.
Yeah. I also like this too, because it also shows that neither the villain nor the hero are like completely worthless in this world, because they both, and really great stories can do this, especially when it comes to like a superhero story, having both the villain and the hero being absolute necessities to the story, for not only in terms of the plot, but also in terms of their own individual characters. Dark Knight does something very similar, where the Joker and Batman need each other to survive. You need that complete opposite person, to, I guess, continue to live in this world and utilize your self-purpose here. It's very interesting that they also use the same thing here, where both characters are not necessarily worthless. Even if Mr. Glass himself can't do too much because of his condition, he is ultimately able to find the person that is complete opposite of him, which is, I guess you could say, what he's been trying to do this whole time.
Yeah, it does introduce kind of a moral conundrum here of, if not for Mr. Glass revealing David's true purpose, then we can insinuate David wouldn't have rescued that family, and he also wouldn't have kept his family apart at home, and everybody would have been worse off for it. Now, so that does introduce, like I said, a moral conundrum there. If those events hadn't happened and Mr. Glass hadn't kind of revealed it to him, but then it still doesn't land. It doesn't necessarily land on the side of that we can excuse Mr. Glass for everything that he's done.
Oh, yeah.
Because, although I do feel it's kind of cheesy and unnecessary, giving us this real life overlay saying, David led the police to limited edition, and now Elijah is confined to a criminally insane asylum. It's like, it's going for too much realism there, I think.
Yeah, and the freeze frame doesn't help at all either. So, but yeah, I mean, for a realistic point of view, it makes sense that this would happen. That David Dunn tells the police and leads the police to Elijah, and then Elijah is put away into an insane asylum. I mean, it makes sense. But yeah, the way that this is also executed is also kind of cheesy, but I do understand they're trying to make it as realistic as possible, as if this kind of thing actually happened, and that it's more of a, what's the correct term? Docudrama-ish kind of style, where it's an event that actually happened, not really, but they play it off as if it's like an actual movie.
Yeah.
So that's what he's going for. I think it's called, no, the term I just learned this recently, it's called pseudo-documentary is kind of what they're going for here to a certain extent, where it plays itself off as somewhat of a documentary where it events this man's life from bad to getting better because of this other man, played off as if it was a realistic situation that happened. But this is definitely more of a cinematic story rather than a documentary kind of story. So
yeah. For like films that are based on a true story, we've been accustomed to the trope of seeing pictures of the real life people, learning a little bit about what they did after the fact of their life, after the fact of the life we see in the movie. So It seems like he's kind of drawing from that trope as well, of the true story type trope, which I never got that sense throughout this whole movie. That's why it just kind of feels out of nowhere to introduce this at the end.
It is a bit odd. I will agree with you there. I think for what Shyamalan is going for, where he is trying to keep this superhero story as realistic as possible, I think definitely works. Because it does kind of lend to this idea that even the most average of people who have not the greatest life, like David Dunn, who's just a normal security guard before he realizes that he has these really strong powers, that everyone has some kind of purpose in their life. That's ultimately what the message is of this movie is. Yeah, everyone, no matter where you are or who you are, you have some kind of social purpose in society. That's what it's trying to say, and keeping that as realistic as he can, while also introducing some supernatural elements in it. He tries to get across that message of even the most average of people can lead extraordinary lives.
And it also ends on a prominently black and white, statement of right and wrong. David does the right thing by turning him in, and Glass justice is served. Crime doesn't pay. He does have to accept the consequences of what he has done. So for that fact, I do appreciate it.
Yeah. I would also like to bring up the fact that the room that him and David are in is kind of out in the open. It's pretty easy for pretty much anybody to walk in there. In fact, we do see people walking back and forth through the doorway in a few shots. So it's almost as if this room is not necessarily a big of a secret. And if anybody were to come in, they would be, I would assume, pretty shocked by the amount of evidence that's here that Elijah was the one who rigged all of the three main terrorist acts. Just saying.
And the way that I guess I can justify that is the way that I landed on Elijah's position is he absolutely wanted to get caught. He wants the recognition of the supervillain. He's tired of living his life as this cripple in the shadows that everybody writes off. Now he's the one that can take credit for A, creating a superhero, creating his counterpart, and B, also for all of these supervillain-esque crimes. So I guess that's the way I can excuse it. It also feels very much like a lair where they kind of have to go down this ramp and into this room where he's got his computers and his diagrams and stuff. So I think it all plays out fairly well. But yeah, those little overlays at the end just they get me every time.
Yeah, I don't necessarily mind the overlays. It's the freeze frame that got me. That gets me.
That gets me too.
That just kind of screams early 2000s cheese. But okay, I will agree with you that his whole goal at the very end here is to get caught. He wants that recognition. I can agree with that. But anyways, yeah. After the title cards and after the freeze frame, that's it. His last line from the movie is, "They call me Mr. Glass." And then as David's walking away.
I do find it to be completely unbelievable that the detectives, nobody's been able to figure out after 3 major incidents that Glass, he's just not a suspect at all on the police
I agree
report.
With that.
That was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. You've been able to get away with all this so easily. So, Alan, what is your rating and recommendation for Unbreakable?
I think what makes Unbreakable stand out from most superhero movies, maybe aside from something like The Dark Knight, is that it does try its hardest to stay as realistic as possible while still introducing a few supernatural elements into it. and there could be multiple reasons why Shyamalan decided to do that, but I think that's the reason why I enjoy this movie as much as I do, is because he keeps it realistic. It's a lesson that plays on emotions, not just trying to teach the audience a lesson just because, like a lot of what Marvel movies do. There's a lot of emotions in this movie, and I really, really enjoy that part of it, because I think he plays them off not only very well, but also is able to teach a lesson through those emotions that he casts out from these actors. The story of redemption, that any man, no matter where he's at in life, can pretty much be a hero to somebody. It's an interesting lesson to show through a realistic standpoint in a superhero movie that it's kind of, I would even go as far as to say it's kind of a sleeper superhero movie, because everything that happens is not necessarily over the top. It's keeps itself pretty level-headed. So there are issues. We've mentioned what issues that exist in this movie, but I would definitely say it's one that I'd like to own eventually on Blu-ray. And I really did enjoy myself watching it again, and I would like to watch it probably some other time down the road, because I did enjoy it that much. So 8 out of 10, pretty solid recommend for me.
Unbreakable is a unique follow-up to Shyamalan's smash hit The Sixth Sense. Despite this project being slightly less ambitious in its storytelling, I appreciate Shyamalan wants to differentiate himself from his previous work and continually do something new, despite maintaining relevant themes such as finding one's place and purpose in this world. For all intents and purposes, Unbreakable is a superhero origin story that audiences come to know on a frequent basis. Of all of them, though, this is the most original. I compliment the whole crew and actors for making a solid narrative piece. That works so well through cinematography, score, and character development. I actually care about these characters. Also, this is a digestible story. It feels short but hearty, and I really enjoy that because most films aren't able to achieve that. It sports a positive worldview of protecting people even when it's a hard thing to do, and a cautionary aspect of trying to gain our identity from someone else leads to self-destruction. There isn't a lot wrong with this movie, save for certain elements. You have to suspend your disbelief in order to accept certain plot points, such as Glass being able to easily get away with so many major crimes, and David's incredibly slow, lifelong realization of his superhuman ability. Oh, also, he realizes he's never gotten sick. Aside from those things, Unbreakable is a unique film and an even more unique superhero film. Although this follow-up to The Sixth Sense is slightly less good, it stands strong on its own merits. I will be returning to Unbreakable often. It receives 8 stars out of 10 with a strong recommend. Well, listeners, we are not coming back with Shyamalan. Next week, we are coming back to finish up our Mad Max retrospective series. We'll be coming back with the third entry, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. So if you have missed out on the first 2 Mad Max podcast reviews, go ahead and check them out in the archives. Make sure to listen to those first before you listen to Beyond Thunderdome. And then the week after that, we will be finishing up with Fury Road. Oh, I'm so excited to finally be getting to Fury Road.
Yes, I'm very excited too. It's been a while. It's actually been a while since I've watched it.
It's been a while for me too. So that's why I'm intrigued to really come back to it. Also, Alan doesn't know this yet, but he will be coming over to watch the Black and Chrome edition.
Oh, I am?
Yes, you are.
I'm okay with that.
Yes, so I definitely wanted us to make sure to watch George Miller's Black and Chrome edition before we did review the movie, because I really want to see what they're able to do with that.
I've always been curious about that release of the movie. I've definitely seen it. I've seen stills, but I haven't exactly sat down to watch it yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very excited to see what that's all about.
Me too. And once we're done with Fury Road, we will be coming back to Shyamalan for 2 more reviews, Signs and The Village, and then we will jump into our Men in Black retrospective series, all 3 of them, which we will lead up to Men in Black International. I also should mention, it's not going to be one of the usual Monday releases. We will have a special kind of weekend of release type one of Avengers Endgame. We did review Infinity War last year, so we did want to review Endgame, which very possibly will probably be the highest grossing film of all time. So I want to make sure we get to review that as well. I'm intrigued to see where they go with it. it's gonna be.
And judging from the ticket sales, it could very well be, because from what I saw the last time I looked, it had outsold Infinity War.
Oh yeah.
And like a bunch of other movies combined
Ooh.
in terms of just pre-release ticket sales. So we'll see what happens if we can even get in on us on a weekend.
That's true. It might not be weekend of release, listeners. It might be a few days after that, maybe midweek of the following week.
Right.
But and I'm not going to be bringing a drink into that movie. It's going to be 3 hours long.
3 hours and 2 minutes.
I'm excited though, because how often do you get to go see a 3-hour movie in theaters?
I'm curious to see what all they're going to pack into this 3-hour movie, because, I mean, Marvel is usually not one to add a bunch of just nonsense stuff, and they at least have some kind of purpose to entertain or whatever. But yeah, I'll be curious to see what all they pack into that 3 hours.
Well, listeners, once again, thank you for joining us. If you liked this podcast, go ahead and subscribe first and foremost, and make sure you get your friends and family members to subscribe. Share it with them. We love talking about movies, and we love talking about them with you. If you never want to miss out on anything that we post, go ahead and follow us through Facebook, Twitter. You can even follow through email on our website. All of those links are in the description below. And if you do really enjoy this podcast and you want to keep the episodes free and you want to just support us for what we're doing, we would really appreciate that. Head on over to our Patreon page where you can buy Q&As. You can do Q&As with us. You can hear our thoughts on the latest movie news and trailers. We will have bonus podcasts over there exclusive just for you, even film commentaries. So we have all of that and more, all for the price of a Starbucks cup of coffee. You drink the coffee, it's gone. This content is yours to keep, so it's a great value for your money. And like we said, it does help us pay to host this on a server, helps us to pay for the bandwidth and the storage capacity for these episodes. So we really would appreciate your support. And if you can't swing a $3 Starbucks cup of coffee, then any kind of donation amount is very much appreciated. So Alan, thank you for joining me.
Sure thing.
We will see you next week with Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Sweet.